moderation is a balance of goods. There are always competing goods in politics. When we talk about democratic politics, we usually think of things like the good of consent, the good of natural rights, the good of equality, these sorts of things. But also another way of moderation is recognizing the legitimate claims of your opponents. You know, the quote I always use from Lincoln from his Washington Temperance Address is that if you would persuade a man, you must first convince him that you are his friend.
Hi, this is Tony Williams, Senior Fellow for BRI, and we want to welcome you to our celebration of Constitution Day. We're honored to be joined by Dan Mahoney, who is the author of The Statesman as Thinker, Portraits of Greatness, Courage, and Moderation, and also by scholar Jon Schaff, who is the author of Abraham Lincoln's Statesmanship and the Limits of Liberal Democracy. As we think about the important themes of rights, law, and liberty for Constitution Day. Now, the guiding question for today's discussion is, how did Abraham Lincoln's statesmanship of principle and prudence guide the nation through the Civil War towards a vision of principled self-government and the common good for all Americans? I want to thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, Tony. Very happy to be here.
Thanks for having me, Tony. I appreciate it.
Great, thanks. Dan, we'll start with you. You wrote a book, The Statesman as Thinker. And so what is statesmanship and what is the role of a statesman in a republic or democracy?
You know, I'm tempted to paraphrase Potter Stewart's famous remark about obscenity, that he knows it when he sees it, but I don't think that will do. One point in the book, I have epigraphs from some of the chapters of the book, and I have a quotation from Stephen Smith, a political theorist at Yale, who says, you know, both Millard Fillmore and Abraham Lincoln were politicians, but that doesn't tell us very much. But Lincoln was a statesman and Millard Fillmore was not, and that tells us a lot more. So that's a good starting point, I think, that the statesmanship involves a level of thoughtfulness, public spiritedness, the exercise of the classical or cardinal virtues, particularly prudence. Today, prudence often is understood to mean timidity or calculation, or what Edmund Burke once called a false reptile prudence, where, you know, wouldn't be prudent to do anything that involved patriotism or exertion. Now, when I use the word prudence, I have in mind what the Greeks called phronesis, practical reason, practical wisdom, which is at once an intellectual and moral virtue. I don't think statesmen, as Charles de Gaulle once said, have to be informed or should be informed by evangelical perfection. But I do think statesmanship involves certain intellectual and moral virtues that involve, for one thing, combining honorable ambition with love of country and public spiritedness. So I think almost by definition, the statesman is not a tyrant. The tyrant is all about self-aggrandizement. Of course, the statesman and the tyrant have in common ambition, but as the political scientist Robert Faulkner has argued, there is a huge difference between a kind of undirected ambition. Lincoln dealt with it in his Lyceum address. The members of the tribe of the lion and eagle who would do anything. Well, you know, they don't want to follow a beaten path. They'll, you know, free the slaves or enslave in order to satisfy their ambition. But that is not honorable ambition. So the idea of a kind of greatness of soul informed by the cardinal virtue of prudence, combined with a kind of public spiritedness that's not soft and not, you might say, excessively idealistic, but takes very seriously the exigencies of the civic common good. And, you know, my book, I really emphasize that in many cases, the highest forms of statesmanship are accompanied by very high levels of thoughtfulness. Lincoln is certainly a wonderful example of that. He didn't write any books, but he's the philosopher poet of the American political order, whether it's the Lyceum Address of 1838 or his second inaugural and everything in between, there's a deep level of reflection, I would say, not only about constitutionalism, not only about the moral foundations of free government, not only about the evils of slavery, but also in a way about himself. What does it mean to be a statesman at the service of a free society? So the Lyceum Address, or an 1864 address in Baltimore, where he reflects on, how hard it is to differentiate the shepherd from the wolf, But he was thinking, he knew that the kind of leadership that was necessary to sustain a free political order is not, he may have talked about government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and he meant it, but he also knew that, when a free political order needed somebody like himself to sustain popular self-government. So that combination, I think, of prudence, of public spiritedness, of honorable ambition, and thoughtfulness, I would say those are, they reflect a tough-minded moderation. And I can't think of a better description for what animated Lincoln, The real heroes were not the abolitionists who would have blown up the Union out of pure principle. The real hero was a statesman such as Lincoln, who knew that a free political order, that the arts of prudence were necessary both to sustain the American Republic and put slavery on the road to eventual extinction.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. So over to you, John. BRI has a lot of curricula that address the civic virtue, and I know you've written about it extensively in your books. So what were the habits of civic virtue that the statesman Lincoln cultivates among Americans for that spirit of a common good and common purpose?
It might be helpful to start by thinking just a little bit about what is virtue. Virtue, of course, means excellence, and it is a product of habit and of action. So a passive people can not be called virtuous. That's not civic virtue if a people is passive. So what are the excellences that Lincoln would like the American people to practice? And I think there's four of them. I hope I can get through these apace. Number one is rule of law, and I think this is going to come up, I think, probably more than once. But Lincoln wants the people to develop a deep respect for the law. The definition of tyranny is when the government acts arbitrarily without limit. One of the virtues of Dan's recent book is its discussion of Cicero, informed eventually by a bit of Christianity, the way it adds a sense of humility and restraint to Aristotle's discussion of magnanimity, this idea of limit. So the rule of law directs the public will and keeps it from being arbitrary. So that's one, rule of law. Two would be moderation, and I mean this in two senses. One is moderation is a balance of goods. There are always competing goods in politics. When we talk about democratic politics, we usually think of things like the good of consent, the good of natural rights, the good of equality, these sorts of things. And you have to give each of these things its proper due. And part of that requires the prudence that Dan just talked about, and the avoidance of ideological politics, which is emphasizing one good thing at the expense of all the other good things. Again, Dan talks about this, I think, mostly when he's talking about Edmund Burke in his recent book, that ideological politics in its quest for purity ends in terror. So this balance of competing goods is a great civic virtue, but also another way of moderation is recognizing the legitimate claims of your opponents. The quote I always use from Lincoln from his Washington Temperance Address is that if you would persuade a man, you must first convince him that you are his friend. You have to give some indication that you understand and respect the other person's point of view. I think you can look at the what is my favorite Lincoln speech, which is the speech at Peoria in 1854 on the repeal of the Missouri Compromise, when over and over in that speech, he gives credit to the Southern opinion and wants to chasten or humble the self-righteousness of Northern opinion, the anti-slavery opinion. We know what side Lincoln's on. He's not siding with the South, but he wants to say, here are their legitimate claims, and I want to forthrightly recognize those, even though I'm now going to say why they're ultimately wrong, right? So rule of law, moderation. I do want to say something about free labor, about an ownership society. Lincoln's economics are driven by a desire for independence rather than wealth creation, though he has no problem with wealth creation. An economy that promotes free labor, right? And the habits of liberty, the habits of a citizen are developed with economic liberty, he thinks, when he says in his Wisconsin agricultural speech that we will be free of crown kings, land kings, and money kings. If each man owns his own labor, what we might call a kind of proprietorship or entrepreneurship is important to create civic virtue. Then last thing, you can't talk about Lincoln without talking about natural rights. I'll talk about probably this more a little bit later, but we all have to recognize there are things that we want that aren't good for us. And if that's true of us as individuals, it's true of us as a people. And there's the justice of the people's decisions are not just reflected that it's an act of public will, but that they conform with some concept of natural justice, which for Lincoln is natural right, as articulated in the Declaration of Independence. So those virtues, again, are rule of law, moderation, a kind of economic liberty, and natural rights. I think these are the things he wants to cultivate.
Excellent. Back over to you, Dan. Lincoln spoke of an apple of gold and a picture of silver, and it's very poetic and eloquent biblical metaphor to describe the connection between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So what were the ennobling and timeless principles of the natural law, of constitutionalism, of law and liberty in Lincoln's words and statesmanship?
Yeah, I think just to relate my remarks to what John had just said, I think it's very clear that Lincoln did not advocate a kind of positivistic constitutionalism, that our principles are simply inherent in the constitutional framework. I think he is not simply a person who affirms the creedal foundations of American liberty. I think you can have a one-sided reading of Lincoln that, in a way, exaggerates the centrality of the Declaration of Independence and ignores all the other pillars John talked about, including a certain understanding of political economy, a certain understanding of the rule of law, a certain understanding of self-restraint. But it is the case that Lincoln saw that the Declaration of Independence, broadly understood, provided the soul, you might say, the animating principles, the animating spirit of America's constitutional arrangements. And of course, that image of the apple of gold and the frame of silver comes from Proverbs. So as so much of Lincoln's rhetoric, it's a kind of biblical republicanism. But I do think there's a reason why certain paleocon conservatives have been so skeptical of Lincoln. I mean, you read some of them going way back, and Lincoln is called a Gnostic and someone with messianic politics, an advocate of the very ideological politics he repudiated. And I think that has to do with this misplaced judgment that an appeal to universal principles is necessarily at odds with a politics of prudence or with the framework of rule of law that instantiates and gives form to those principles, the principles of the Declaration among them. And I also would say that Lincoln, there's lots of debates about what the Declaration is. You can read it in a kind of strictly Lockean way, but it is important, I think, that Lincoln placed great emphasis on its religious dimension. And that meant liberty under God. Tocqueville has a beautiful expression, liberty under God and the laws. I think Lincoln in his own way affirms that at Gettysburg and elsewhere, that it's, the Declaration is not only a declaration of independence, it's not only an affirmation of enduring truths. It's not only right-centered, but it also gives rise to high claims about duty and honor and self-respect.
So, Jon, the Emancipation Proclamation has really come under a great deal of scrutiny, perhaps even criticism in recent years.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in thinking about his statesmanship, how does Lincoln combine the principles of the moral law, of understanding that slavery is morally wrong, with the prudence and restraint of a constitutional statesman with the Emancipation Proclamation?
Yeah, I think probably if there are probably two complaints about the Emancipation Proclamation. One is, you know, the argument of Richard Hofstadter in the mid 20th century that it had all the moral grandeur of a bill of lading, which means like a sales receipt, basically. And then the argument that you're probably more referring to, the contemporary argument, is that it didn't really free the slaves. It didn't go far enough. It was too restrained. So let's take some of those in turn. Well, Lincoln didn't use poetry in the Emancipation Proclamation because he wanted it to be seen as a legal action. Lincoln had argued that a constitutional amendment or possibly compensated emancipation are the only way constitutionally to get rid of slavery. But in the midst of war, he argued that as a war measure, using his commander-in-chief power, he could emancipate slaves under certain conditions, which I'll get to in a second. And so the wording of the document is a legal document. It's not a poetic document that we normally expect from Lincoln, especially when he's dealing with slavery. And so, but other people, the argument is that it didn't go far enough. So just recall that slaves in various states, Missouri, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, were still in the Union. And they were not freed by the proclamation, as well as areas under Union control, parts of the Confederacy under Union control. Well, again, Lincoln is issuing this as a war measure. Therefore, he doesn't think that it pertains to those places not at war with the United States, with the Union. And so, you know, his Secretary of Treasury, Salmon Chase, criticized him for not going further. Chase, an abolitionist, and Lincoln simply responded. I'll quote from him when he said, "What defense is there of an extension beyond where he had these areas that were at war with the United States? Quote, except the one that I think the measure politically expedient and morally right. Would I not thus give up all footing upon constitution or law? Would I not thus be in the boundless field of absolutism? Could this pass unnoticed or unresisted?" He simply didn't think he had the legal authority to free all slaves, which is why he supported the 13th Amendment, because it did free all slaves. And then he wasn't sure the Emancipation Proclamation would be good law once conflict was over. And so the 13th Amendment deals with this question of when hostilities are done, now what's the status of slaves? Well, the 13th Amendment deals with that.
Lincoln provides us with really an unparalleled example of unity, a spirit of a common purpose. Again, in the beautiful and eloquent second inaugural address, which we've alluded to. How does he seek to bind the nation together in that common set of ideals, that common purpose that can provide maybe a strong example for us today?
Well, I mean, I guess an answer to that would be in part speculative, but I think we can see in the Gettysburg Address of November 1863 and the second inaugural, sort of a two-thronged effort to encourage what Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address had called a new birth of freedom. And a new birth of freedom necessarily entailed some active effort, not only to abolish chattel slavery, but to make Blacks full or fuller participants in the American Republic. I think once Lincoln made that decision to arm free Blacks and have them fight for union and liberty, once blood was shed on behalf of common principle and common purpose, there was no going back. And we know 4 days before Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater, he delivered a speech on the franchise in Louisiana where I think it shows where he was heading. He didn't call for universal suffrage for ex-slaves or for blacks, but he called for black suffrage, and I think he alludes to essentially the most educated. I think he wanted a gradual approach, not the sort of heavy-handed approach pursued by radical Republicans after 1866, but he wanted a prudent approach that was unequivocal in its recognition of common citizenship, but that recognized, I guess, there are some preconditions of that, and there may be a transition, and one has to deal, of course, with white opinion. Even Lincoln was good at that because, Lincoln, in the Lincoln Douglas debates or many of the speeches he gave in Illinois in the late 1850s, he was dealing with a free soil population that was anti-slavery, but by today's standards, racist. And so most of those lines or qualifications that are always conditional, you don't have to just because you can't enslave, I have no right to enslave a black woman doesn't mean you have to marry her. My students look at that and say, this horrible racist. This was a statesman trying to get people who didn't want too much, interplay between black and white populations to at least recognize the starting point, the humanity of the black man and woman, and then the follow-up to them, their citizenship in a political order dedicated to common purpose. Now, with today, I would say, I think part of what we have to do is recover what I'm going to call the moral grandeur of Lincoln's perspective. And that means recovering the moral grandeur of statesmen like Prudence. It is calamitous, I think, that most intellectuals and most academics and the students who study under them think that the fanaticism of the abolitionists is the moral high ground. And Lincoln's position was much more arduous. It involved much less self-righteousness and moral preening. It involved exactly the coming together of principle and prudence that was needed to address the sectional problem as well as the problem of chattel slavery. And Lincoln's also very important for us today because he provided an accurate genealogy of the founders' views on slavery. The Cooper's Union address, for example, in New York, is so important because right before the Civil War, Lincoln makes very clear that we have to, at a minimum, remain faithful to the founders' position to put slavery on the road to eventual extinction. And that meant, all the measures that were taken, the abolition of the slave trade, the Northwest Ordinance forbidding slavery in new states and territory, all of that.
And John, last question. So you and Dan write of Lincoln's what's called political or civil religion. What principles and virtues comprise that civil religion, and how could embracing this vision maybe help unify us again more today?
Sure, we've referenced multiple times that Lyceum address, and that's where Lincoln explicitly says that the rule of law should become a political religion. What the founders sacrificed their sacred, their lives and their sacred honor to the Declaration. He says we should do the same for the Constitution, the rule of law more broadly. So there's a concept here of gratitude. Be thankful for and protect that which has been handed down to you. And that's an important virtue. And then, as the subtitle of my book suggests, limits. We need to live within limits. And as I kind of referenced before, we all know when we look into our hearts that we all want things that aren't good for us, even if it's something as mundane as that second donut. It's not good for us. And sometimes it's more morally serious things than donuts. But what does a good parent, pastor, friend, teacher do? They say no to you. And this is what a statesman has to do sometimes, is say no. And this is, I think, at the heart of Lincoln's political religion. Again, partially with the rule of law, that's a big part of it. But also, I think, in that defense of natural right, of which Lincoln's defense of natural equality stems from. So whatever our inequalities, and there are some, they don't translate into a right to rule or the right to have, some people have more rights than other natural rights than other people do. So even if a majority wants something and they think they see it as good and desirable, if it violates the standard of natural justice, then it's wrong. Because there's a standard that's beyond public opinion. And so Lincoln said in that 1854 Peoria address that there has to be a standard of justice beyond self-interest.
Well, Dan Mahoney and Jon Schaff, I want to thank you very much for joining us as part of our BRI Constitution Day celebration. And you've given us a lot to think about. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Tony.
Great. And thank you all for joining us for this conversation with two of our finest scholars to consider these timeless principles for Constitution Day.